Okay. You hear me, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, good. You know, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi says you should start a shir with Milsa de B'dichusa, with a joke. But you know, we're living through such difficult times now that I don't know if we should start with a joke. But if I had to start with a joke just to be Mekayim Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, I'm reminded of the story. You remember the Concorde plane? You know, they took it out of use within a short period of time. You know, the Concorde plane, it was like super fast.
Yes.
So anyway, somebody died, Nebuch in England, and they called up a rabbi in New York to officiate at the funeral. And, you know, because the time difference and also the travel time, how could he get to the funeral? But he actually got on a Concorde plane and he arrived before the Patira. Anyway, so we're here on page Lamed Vav, and there's a whole section here that we want to study. Again, I was thinking of skipping it because it's really complicated, but we'll try to figure it out, in which the Ramban, having defended the Bahag, let's just review, the Bahag is of the opinion that we count mitzvos d'Rabbanan in Taryag, and one of the examples, and the Rambam really fights against this, is Hallel, meaning that Hallel is a mitzvah d'Rabbanan. And how then can you include it in Taryag, which is the Rambam's objection to the Bahag? The Ramban comes to the defense of the Bahag by saying that we do count mitzvahs d'Rabbanan in Taryag because they were all given already to Moshe Rabbeinu at Har Sinai. In other words, there was an anticipation, and the Ramban even proves that there's certain mitzvahs d'oraisa that the Rambam counts in Taryag, and yet they didn't exist at the time that Moshe Rabbeinu received the Torah at Har Sinai. They were only generated later on. But Kitza, to make a long story short, I'll be right with you, Bruce. I just want to make this point. The Ramban bends, overboard in order to defend the Bahag and that position that even mitzvahs d'Rabbanan are part of Taryag. In fact, he points out that it's so odd that the Rambam, who himself elevates all d'Rabbanans to a mitzvah saseh and a mitzvah lo saseh, and yet the Rambam refuses to include d'Rabbanans in Taryag. Okay, that's not a terrible kasha. I mean, that's not catastrophic. I mean, the Rambam might hold that if a person, defies and denies the authority of the Rabbanon, he's in violation of Baltasir, Lo Tasir, and fulfill Sisa Kol Yisrael. Fine. But let's, according to the Rambam, maintain that very fundamental distinction between the Oraisas and the Rabbanons. And let's not elevate the Rabbanons to Taryag. Yeah, Bruce.
So I'm always confused, or often confused on this particular point. It may be that giving thanks is d'oraita, and yet the specific words in Hallel may be written by the rabbis. So I'm never sure whether the essence of something is d'oraita, but the way we carry it out is Rabban, and therefore what category it really falls under.
Excellent. So let's say, for example, a wonderful example of your point would be tefillah, right? Tefillah, the Rambam says is d'oraisa, and he derives it based on the Sefer from v'avadatem and says Hashem l'keich b'chol avavchem ezi avodah shebelev zui tefillah. And yet, all at tefillos were established by the Rabbanon. In fact, the nusach tefillah that we recite 3 times a day was created by the rabbis. So again, the basic fundamental mitzvah of tefillah in and of itself could be fulfilled even without the nusach of Chazal, without the specific formulation that was organized and established by the Chazal, and that's d'oraisa. Hence, the Rambam is justified to count tefillah within the context of Taryag mitzvahs. The fact that the specific way and what time we daven, how many times a day, and the nusach tefillah, all that was established by the Rabbanan as a takanas chazal, whether it's keneged avos or keneged karbanos, but it's always a takana. The Gemara always uses the word takana over and over again. That doesn't undermine the fact that the mitzvah of tefillah in its basic formulation, in its nitty-gritty, naked tefillah, that's doraisa.
So then what does the Ramban and the Ramban actually argue about if they agree that the essence of it is Doraita?
They're going to argue about mitzvahs which the essence of which is only D'Rabbanan, meaning Ner Chanukah, the Torah didn't tell us to light candles.
No, even tefillah. The Ramban says it's D'Rabbanan.
Well, the Ramban says that according, you remember if you want to go over this, we can go over this inside, but I want to move on. The Ramban points out that the Rambam Shita is that it's Doraisa because Tefillah Doraisa is obligated by the mitzvah of the Avadatem es Hashem Elokeichem. So therefore, the Ramban himself, even if he would grant the Rambam's premise that only mitzvahs Doraisa could be counted in Taryag, he would nevertheless concede the Rambam's position that Tefillah should be counted in Taryag. And we explain why. The Ramban has another approach. Inami, as we say, Ibai Sema. The other possibility, says the Ramban, is because B'eis Sarah, at a moment of dire need, of emergency, Tefillah is Doraisa. So that Tefillah could be counted in Taryag, even if I reject the Bahag and I'm on the turf of the Rambam, that we only count mitzvahs Doraisa in Taryag. Nevertheless, Tefillah, in its essence, at least in one category of scenarios, is Doraisa. So we have two explanations or justifications for counting Tefillah as a mitzvah Doraisa, even if I hold like the Rambam that the Rabbanans are disqualified. They cannot be included in Taryag. We could say because the basic nitty-gritty mitzvah of tefillah, without the nusach, without the zmani of tefillah, is doraisa, and the Torah obligates that under v'avadetem. Or we can say that b'shas tzara, b'yeis tzara, we're obligated in tefillah. And therefore there's one box, one situation in which there is a mitzvah doraisa of tefillah, and that's enough to justify counting it in Taryag. So at the end of the day, the Ramban is on the same page as the Rambam with regard to those mitzvos which fundamentally are doraisa, and the method and the situations and the nuances of Jewish law by which I fulfill that mitzvah doraisa are d'Rabbanan. But the fundamental basic mitzvah is doraisa. And that's where the Ramban would argue that v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. What does that mean? And the Rabbanan say it means Bikur Cholim and Nicham Avelim and Hafnosas Kal, etc., etc. That's counted in Taryag, even if I only counted Taryag a mitzvah doraisa, because the Rabbanan are only filling in the details and the nuances, the when and the how, but the fundamental mitzvah is Ava, the Ahavta l'reacha kamoch, and that's going to be counted in Taryag. Similarly, the mitzvah of Chol HaMoed, which is derived from Mikroi Kodesh, is counted in Taryag, hands down. What is Mikroi Kodesh? What does it mean? There's no Kiddush. There's no mitzvah of Kiddush on Chol HaMoed. So how do I fulfill Mikroi Kodesh? And the Rabbanan are going to define 5 categories in which you're allowed to do malacha. And if those 5 categories don't exist and you can't check off any of those boxes, then it comes under the Isser of Mikrai Kodesh. And that's going to be Doraisa. And V'nisem es nafsho seichem, if you recall that discussion where the Torah doesn't specify exactly, do I have to put pins into my, sit on a bed of pins on Yom Kippur? And the Rabbanan are going to be authorized to define the specifics, the nuances, the when and the where and the how of V'nisem es nafsho seichem, and it's going to be counted in Taryag. And there are many, many examples where the Torah leaves a mitzvah ambiguous, general, without specifying, and authorizes the Rabbanan to step up to the plate, if I could use that American idiomatic phrase, and define the specifics of that mitzvah. But now we discuss Hallel. Hallel, says the Ramban, according to the Bahag, is counted in Taryag as one of 7 mitzvos out of 613 that are D'Rabbanan. And the Ramban has gone, as we said before, overboard to defend the Bahag's fundamental position that we can include and we will include mitzvos D'Rabbanan in Taryag. And even though Hallel is all mizmorim that were authored by David HaMelech in Tehillim, obviously were not in existence at the time that Moshe Rabbeinu stood at Har Sinai. Nevertheless, the Rabbanan established the mitzvah of Hallel, and like Chanukah, Ner Shabbos, Ner, and Mikra Megillah, and many others, Netilas Yadayim, we will count it in Taryag. That's the Bahag and the Ramban. If you take a look here, he says, we already are committed. Shebal halachos machnis becheshben hazeh. He will incorporate it into the calculation of 613 mitzvos shel divreim, mitzvos that are d'Rabbanan. V'lamadu of schus, and we spoke on his behalf, on his defense, because Havnu his natzlu so, and we have formulated the justification for including mitzvahs d'Rabbanan on the Taryag. And basically, again, as we said over and over again, the mitzvahs that were given to Moshe at Har Sinai will go beyond that which was obvious, that which was revealed, that which was relevant at the time of Moshe Rabbeinu. Baruch Hu gave an entire corpus of mitzvahs to Moshe Rabbeinu, many of which were not yet clarified and established and not even relevant. Avol, he says, but here I have a problem, says the Ramban. His horarnu, miloshen he'ora. He'ora means, when you have a question on something, it stimulates your curiosity. Ala Hallel. I was curious, says the Ramban, why the Bahag invites Hallel into the membership of Taryag mitzvos as a mitzvah d'Rabbanan. Mipnei she'ein lanu mefurash b'Hallel, I'm going to skip a few words, d'oraisa. The Ramban is going to give us a number of scenarios and situations in which we are obligated to recite Hallel, and the Ramban says they're d'oraisa. Meaning that Hallel does not just emerge ex nihilo out of nowhere as a takana d'Rabbanan, but rather within the framework of a doraisa, the Torah obligates us to recite Hallel. Says the Ramban, I'll prove it to you. And he has 3 categories of Hallel, all of which are obligated by a doraisa, and therefore Hallel should be classified as doraisa. What are these 3? Number 1, he's got Hallel shel shchitas haPesach. This is a sugya in Masechta Pesachim on Daf Pei Hey Amud Beis 85b. There, the Gemara establishes that when they went out on Erev Pesach, the 14th of Nisan at Chatzos, to shech the Korban Pesach in the Azorah, they recited Hallel. It's interesting. The Gemara describes the Hallel that it was like rocking the boat. What do I mean? was rocking. The Gemara says that they went up to the rooftops to recite Hallel, and the rooftops started shaking, and there was like such a gigantic noise. Now that's the Hallel at the time of Achilas HaPesach. The Ramban is assuming, and we'll see why in a minute, that in addition to the Hallel on the night of Pesach, Tesvav Balayla, that they recited at the time of the eating of the Korban Pesach, there was an additional Hallel that was recited at the time of the Shchitas HaPesach. So we're turning the clock 6 hours earlier to midday on the 14th of Nisan. Now, Rabosa, you and I know that we have a Hallel that is incorporated into the Seder. In fact, it's one of the Simanim, right? The next to the last is Hallel. That Hallel is a different Hallel entirely. That Hallel is part of a different mitzvah. It's not a separate mitzvah of Hallel, but it's a part of and a subcategory of a different mitzvah. Which mitzvah do I have in mind? Sefer Yetzias Mitzrayim. So that Sefer Yetzias Mitzrayim includes not only telling the story and Maskel B'Gnus, Avodim Hayinu, Messiah B'Shvach, HaKadosh Baruch Hu took us out of, redeemed us from slavery, but it also includes Hallel Ve'Hodah, to thank Hashem and express our appreciation for having redeemed us from slavery. And that's the Hallel that we recite in the framework, integrated into the framework of the Seder. But in addition, there was another Hallel. And we have a zecher to that Hallel. That additional Hallel was only recited when the Beis HaMikdash stood and they ate from the basa of the Korban Pesach. We have a Hallel that parallels the Hallel that was recited when the Mikdash stood at the time of the Achilas HaPesach. Which is that Hallel? The Hallel in the Beis HaKnesses. So on the night of Pesach, we have two Hallels. We have the Hallel in the Beis HaKnesses, and we have the Hallel that's integrated into the Seder when we come home to our own personal homes. The first Hallel is the Hallel of Korban Pesach. We don't have the Korban Pesach, we have a Zecher. The second Hallel is the Hallel of Sefer Yetzias Mitzrayim. Says the Ramban, but there's another Hallel that we don't have today. We don't even have a Zecher to this Hallel. And this is the Hallel at the time the Mikdash stood that was recited on Erev Pesach in the Beis HaMikdash at the time of the Shchitas HaPesach. And the Ramban is going to argue that that Hallel is Doraisa and is generated by the Mitzvah Doraisa of Shchitas HaPesach. Furthermore,
No, you muted yourself.
Oh, I did?
No, it's okay. It just came back.
Yeah, I don't know. The technology here is a little bit iffy.
Is the Hallel the exact same words in all cases?
That's an excellent question because, again, the Hallel is taken from Tehillim, that's David HaMelech. We're talking about the Beis HaMikdash. I'm not sure if already at the time of the Beis HaMikdash, they recited the Tehillim of David HaMelech. It's possible they did. David HaMelech, as you know, was before Shlomo HaMelech, and therefore he was before the Mikdash. But Shchitas HaPesach is not dependent on the Beis HaMikdash at all. And I have to apologize if I overuse the word Beis HaMikdash, because Shchitas HaPesach applies even in the Mishkan, way before the Beis HaMikdash of Shlomo HaMelech. So what was the nature of that Hallel? As we said before, what was the nature of Tefillah before the Anshe Knesset HaGdol established the Nusach of Tefillah? And then he goes on, he says, V'achilasa. So in addition to the Shechita on Erev Pesach, which generates a Hallel that the Ramban believes is a Mitzvah Doraisa, we have another Hallel on Pesach, that's on the Leil HaPesach, at the time of Achilas HaKarban. Then he has a third category. He says, Hallel shel netilas lulav. Now, where was the lulav taken? So my opinion would be, you could disagree with me, that the lulav was taken in the Beis HaMikdash. What are you talking about? Are you off your rocker, Berzon? The lulav was taken by every single person in his house, in shul, during tefillah. No. It says, "Usmachtem lifnei Hashem Elokechem shivas yomim," and the Gemara in Sukkah establishes that the simcha of shivas yomim in the Mikdash was fulfilled with the lulav. And now the Ramban adds Hallel. So when in the Beis HaMikdash they took the lulav for 7 days in order to fulfill the mitzvah of usmachtem, that mitzvah of usmachtem with the lulav was accompanied by Hallel. And that Hallel is Dorais.
Isn't there a Gemara?
Hallel b'shas shchitas haPesach, Hallel b'shas achilas haPesach, and Hallel b'shas netilas lulav, all of which are generated by a mitzvah Doraisa, whether it's shchita, whether it's achila and Pesach, or whether it's netilas lulav and Mikdash. And that generates a chiyuv Hallel Doraisa. And the Ramban is perplexed. Why does the Bahag assume that Hallel is the Rabbanon? Yeah.
Didn't the people bring the lulavim before Shabbat and leave them there so they'd have them ready on Shabbat?
Yeah. So, first of all, let's talk about a regular, Yom HaRishon, the first day of Sukkot, which was on a weekday. If it was if the first day of Sukkot coincided with Shabbat, then you might have a number of issues. One issue would be Hotzah, right, to carry the lulav from a Rishus HaYochid into a Rishus HaRabim. Again, you have to know the dinim of Hotzah, but let's assume there would be a violation of Hotzah. Then there's an additional problem of Muktzah. And then we get back to the Ramban's discussion about whether Muktzah is Doraisa or Muktzah is D'Rabbanan that we discussed a few weeks ago. But in any event, whether they took the lulav before Shabbos or on a Yontif, whatever it might be, there was a Hallel that accompanied Netilas lulav in the Beis HaMikdash, and that Hallel is Doraisa. And he says that Rishon de Pesach Vatzeres, what about the Hallel that's recited on the first day of Pesach and the first day of Atzeres? Now, I don't know why he leaves out Sukkot here. That's a pella to me. Maybe he feels that since he already mentioned Lulav, he doesn't have to mention the Hallel of Pesach. I don't know. But he mentions Rishon de Pesach and Atzeres. Atzeres is not Rishon because it's only one day of Atzeres. So that I don't know. And the Ramban writes, B'chol elu, in all the above, ein lanu raya sheyehe midivreim. We have no source that these are D'Rabbanan, since they are generated by a Doraisa, by Simcha, by Shchita, by Achila in the case of a Karban. Therefore, we should assume that they are Doraisa. They are generated by a mitzvah Doraisa. The Machayev is Doraisa. Therefore, the Chiyuv is Doraisa. Like the Machayev itself is Doraisa. But again, Ein Lanu Raya. But now the Ramban says, I do have a right. Why? From a Gemara in Masechta Tainis. The Gemara says, as Hallel de Rosh Chodesh lav doraisa. What does that sound like to you? When you hear those words, Hallel on Rosh Chodesh is not doraisa, what does that sound like by implication?
The Rabbanan.
No. I didn't mean that. Lav doraisa means D'Rabbanan. But when I tell you, I get up here, imagine if Beit Midrash Tzurit was full with Bruce's Talmidim here, and I make a statement in front of this whole gigantic base metrish, which probably could fit close to 100 people, and I would say, Hallel on Rosh Chodesh is the Rabbana. What would you object to? Only on Rosh Chodesh is the Rabbana? Okay, you're telling me that Rosh Chodesh is on a lower level. It doesn't have a full-fledged mitzvah of simcha. There's no simcha on Rosh Chodesh. And the proof in the pudding is that we don't have a su'ud on Rosh Chodesh. Some people have a su'ud on Rosh Chodesh. Maybe there's mixas simcha, because Gemara says that Rosh Chodesh is also b'tainis, who has been tainis. But basically, there's no b'samachta on Rosh Chodesh, and therefore it doesn't generate a mitzvah of Hallel. Hallel is always connected to a simcha, where it's a simcha of shechting the Korban Pesach once a year, of achilas Pesach once a year, of lulav and migdash once a year, or the first day of Sukkot, the first day of Atzeres, the first day of Pesach. There's a mitzvah v'samachta. But on Rosh Chodesh, there's no mitzvah v'samachta. And hence, there's no mitzvah of Hallel. And the Rabbanan established Hallel on Rosh Chodesh. Well, that's an issue. I'm not sure if the Rabbanan established Hallel on Rosh Chodesh or they did not. The Ramban seems to assume, based on the Gemara in Tainus, that there is a mitzvah of Hallel on Rosh Chodesh. He says the following, Umashmos zeh, the implication is that to be Yomim Sha'yochid Gomer Behem es HaHallel, on Rosh Chodesh we don't recite the complete Hallel, we recite what we call in Yiddish Halb Hallel, but then there's an entire list in the Gemara in Erchin of Yomim Shabahem Gomrim es HaHallel, which is an upgrade on Rosh Chodesh. That's a whole different Hallel. That's not the Hallel of Rosh Chodesh. When the Gemara says that the Hallel of Rosh Chodesh is D'Rabbanan, that's not the real McCoy Hallel. That's like a fakerai Hallel. That's like a substitute Hallel. The Sfaradim, many of them, not all of them, would not even recite a bracha on Hallel Rosh Chodesh. No bracha whatsoever. Not the first and not the last. If you don't believe me, come here on Friday. You'll have to go down a flight of steps, and you'll see they're not going to make a bracha. So therefore, when the Gemara tells me that Hallel Rosh Chodesh is the Rabbanan, what the Gemara means to say, says the Ramban, that this is not the real Hallel. But on those days when we recite the real McCoy Hallel Sholem, Shegomrim As HaHallel, and according to the Sfaradim, Eidota Mizrach, they'll recite the bracha Asher Kidsharim Etzosav Etzivanu Ligmares HaHallel. That's Doraisa. Otherwise, why did you have to point out to me that Hallel Rosh Chodesh is the Rabbanan? If the whole Hallel, from soup to nuts, the whole enterprise of Hallel is only the Rabbanan, why do you isolate Rosh Chodesh? Umashmo zeh, if I derive the conclusion to be Yomim Shayochid Gomer Be'emes HaHallel, the real McCoy Hallel, Hu Doraisa. Now the Ramban is saying, okay, till now we had no proof one way or the other, but this is a clear-cut indication that Hallel is Doraisa. Why do Ramban have to be machadish to me? The Gemara had to tell me a chiddush. You discover in America that Hallel on Rosh Chodesh is the Rabbanan. Hallel is always the Rabbanan. The answer is that Hallel is always Doraisa. And when the Torah commands you in a mitzvah Doraisa with simcha that has to be accompanied by Hallel, that's a Doraisa. The exception to the rule is the so-called Hallel of Rosh Chodesh, which is not really Hallel at all. Rabbeinu Tam is famous for saying, and that's why we recite Hallel with a bracha on Rosh Chodesh. Do you know how Rabbeinu Tam justifies a bracha on Hallel on Rosh Chodesh? I'm just mentioning this as a side point. Anybody know? Delogara mikriya b'Torah. He says that when you read psukim in Tanakh, you make a bracha. And the recitation of Hallel is no worse than reciting psukim in the Torah. And therefore we make a bracha. Filei plata. Asher kitshana mitzvosav etzivanu likros hallel. What shaykhis? What's the relationship between that bracha and reading psukim in the Torah? On that, there's a lot of brisket Torah, but leave it out. U'b'meseches erchin, that's the famous sugi of Hallel, darshubo. The Gemara has a pasuk in Yeshayahu Navi to derive the mitzvah of Hallel. I'm not sure if that's enough to make it doraisa, but let's see what the Ramban has to say about it. Hashir yiyeh lachem kilel his kadesh chag. Yeshayahu Navi is talking about the miraculous salvation of the Jewish people in the battles against Sancheriv. And he tells the Jewish people that they should be singing a song of praise to Hashem. But he equates it with Leil his Kadesh Chag, which means the night of Pesach. And basically the Navi is saying to the people, just like no one would question that on the night of Pesach we recite Hallel as part of the mitzvah of Achilas Korban Pesach, so too we should be reciting Hallel for the great victory and the salvation at the time of Sancheriv. And that's the pasuk. Shir yiyeh lachem kilel, like the night of his Kaddish Chag. Laila makudish b'chag ton shira. She'eno makudish l'chag eno ton shira. So even though, as a general rule, if there's no Kedushas Chag, what we call Kedush Hayom, there is no Hallel, Shira. However, the exception is going to be this case where the entire Jewish population was spared miraculously. That's why the Gemara thinks that even on Purim, we should be reciting Hallel. And the Gemara gives various answers. And certainly on Hanukkah, which is at least the spiritual salvation of the Jewish people, we do recite Hallel. So basically, a Leil she'eno mekudesh l'chag, eno ton shira, except for a Nes for the entire tzibur. And I know, Bruce, exactly what you're thinking here, especially a week before that day on the Hebrew calendar here in the modern Zionist state of Israel. So I know exactly what you're thinking. And the question is, did we experience a miracle that saved the entire Jewish nation, like at the time of Sancheriv? And if we did, then we're required to say Hallel. If we didn't, then it comes under the category of Leil she'eno mekudesh chag. So we're going to assume now, and again, this has to be studied, that Hanukkah was a miracle that impacted on the entire Jewish community. Purim was certainly a miracle on the entire Jewish community, and therefore Purim requires Hallel. And any other salvation that impacts on the entire Jewish community requires Hallel. So, for example, the Beis HaMikdash, which impacts on the entire Jewish community, would require Hallel. That's why, as you know, the Rabbanut here in the state of Israel, after the Milchemet Sheshet Hayamim, when they freed Yerushalayim, they felt that that was a miracle of the Six-Day War that impacted on the entire Jewish community, and therefore they established the Horah that I follow till this day to recite Hallel with a bracha on Chavches Iyov. That was my father's minhag, and that's my minhag as well. The Afal Pisha Zemi Divrei Kabbalahu, do I have a proof from the Gemara in Erchin that Hallel is Doraisa when you're quoting a pasuk in Nach? A pasuk in Nach generates what's called a Mitzva Divrei Kabbalah, but not a Doraisa. Now, what exactly that means, we had a discussion about this a few months ago, that when the Rabbanan establish a mitzvah based on the Tanakh, that has a different status. That gives the Rabbanan an authority of unusual import that jacks up a mitzvah midivrei Kabbalah to almost a doraisa. I say almost. It's not a doraisa, but it's almost a doraisa. Like, for example, Megillah reading. And, we don't know in Tveria whether to read Megillah on Yudalid or on Tesvav. Was it Mukafes Choma, Mimos Yoshua? Was it not? And we will read the Megillah on both Yudalid and Tesvav in Tveria. Are you with me? Why? Why not say something to Ramban L'Kula? So the Turi Even, Rav Shagasari, is very famous for saying, because Megillah is Midivrei Kabbalah. The obligation to recite the Megillah is derived from Tanakh. I mean, Megillah Esther is one of the 24 holy books. So that gives it a status of Divrei Kabbalah, which has its own category. Says the Ramban, no. Hallel is not Midivrei Kabbalah. Hallel is the Oraisa. Why? Aval Yomar Anovi ki yashiru lekel Moshia osa miyad sancherev kashere mishorim belel is kadishcha shulel achilas haPesach shayu mishorim bekol gadol. As we saw, I mentioned it earlier in the Gemara Pesachim Pehei Kizayis Pischa Valela Poka Igra. The roofs were shaking because of the Kriyas Hallel on Leila Pesach. And that becomes the paradigm for Kriyas Hallel as a mitzvah d'oraisa, so that the Navi, in trying to impress the Jewish people about the obligation to recite Hallel in a circumstance where God intervened miraculously to save the Jewish nation as a whole, he equates it with the paradigmic mitzvahs Hallel d'oraisa, which was fulfilled, as the Gemara describes it in Pesachim Pehei, when they ate the Korban Pesach. Now, again, if we were learning the Sugi Pesachim, we'd have to ask the following question. They ate the Korban Pesach downstairs, then they climbed upstairs to the rooftops to recite Hallel. That itself needs analysis. Yeah, Bruce?
Does the recitation of Hallel need to be on the people in its entirety? I mean, Jews are scattered all over the world. So let's say Jews are getting liberated from camps in Europe on a certain day.
I would say Rove. I would say Rove Klal Yisrael. It depends where. In other words, every community, if it's saved from an impending doom, requires Hallel on that day. But that doesn't mean that every Jew on the face of the globe has to recite Hallel.
Then we learned that a bomb fell on the roof of Panovich Yeshiva and didn't explode, and so based on that, maybe they did say Hallel in the beginning. And
I assume that they did say Hallel. They should be saying Hallel to this day, I think. But my point only is that when you require a miracle that impacted on, right? Because again, we're not saying that this particular community has to recite Hallel. We're saying that Gans Klal Yisrael has to recite Hallel. For that, you need at least Rove. That's why I said about Yushalayim. Yushalayim has an impact on the entire Jewish people, and maybe the establishment of the state of Israel. See, the problem is with Hallel Yom Ha'atzmaut. When I was in yeshiva many, many moons ago, they invited Rav Ovadia Yosef to speak in our yeshiva. And when he got up to speak, he introduced his drasha with the following words. He says, I spoke to Rav Soloveitchik, and he agreed with me, and therefore I'm allowing myself to give the shir. Interesting how much respect he had for Rav Soloveitchik. But basically, he came to the conclusion that we don't recite Hallel with a bracha on Yom Ha'atzmaut. And many of the Sfaradim who follow the Psak of Rav Ovadia will not, recite Hallel, but they'll omit the bracha. And they're used to that anyway, because every Rosh Chodesh they omit the bracha. So it's part of the tradition, you know what I mean? And basically, there may be many issues here about a bracha on Hallel, but one of the issues is that the Yishuv at that time in 1947 represented only a minority of the Jewish population. So herein you get to a chakira. Do we look at the miracle in its time, and that's how we define it, or do we look at the miracle in a broader context, like we did with regard to Yerushalayim? In a broader context, one could ostensibly argue, again, if you're not an anti-Zionist, that the establishment of the state of Israel is a miracle that impacts on the entire Jewish community, even though at that time the Yishuv, I don't remember exactly how many people were I don't even know.
600,000.
600,000, no?
Yeah.
Is that what you just said, Bruce? Okay, yep. Baruch Hashem. I didn't want to say it because I didn't want to be a laughing stock, but that's how I remember it. 600,000, Shishim Ribu. Again, if you're ever interested in talking about Yom Ha'atzmaut, my Bible for Yom Ha'atzmaut is what's called Sheish Tefikot, in an essay by Rav Soloveitchik called Kol Dodi Dofek, which has been translated to many, many languages. And I'm most fascinated by the first of the 6 Tefikos was the vote in the United Nations. And the Rav points out that it's the first time in history that the East and the West, meaning the Russians and the Americans, voted in unison for, in this case, the establishment of the state of Israel. It never happened. And he dramatizes it. You remember the picture of all the Jews listening to the radio, on that fateful night, as the votes were coming into the United Nations. You've seen it,
Look, we say that a minority of
By
Jews
the way,
left Egypt.
I just want to say one thing in passing. This is off the record. I don't know if you've ever seen a video called The Long Road Home. Have you seen it? I have a copy of it. If you want to borrow it, maybe you could even show it on Zoom. I don't know the technology, because it's a cassette video, so I don't know exactly how you do that. But maybe by now you could get it in a different form. I just have like the original. It was produced by the Simon Wiesenthal Center in LA. You familiar with that? Simon Wiesenthal, ring a bell. Today is Yom HaShoah, so we can mention Simon Wiesenthal. He was a Nitzol Shoah. Anyway, it's a Long Road Home. It's a video, a documentary about the 3 years between 1945 and 1948. The Long Road Home. It's a fascinating documentary. All right, where are we up to?
That since a minority of Jews left Egypt, which is our tradition, we don't apply this rule of rove in that case. I mean, I don't understand that if an entire
the Hallel of Pesach is a different Hallel entirely. It's not relevant to our discussion. When I spoke about, the establishment of the state and so forth and so on, that has to do with Hatzalah. The Hallel of Pesach has to do with Leil Kaddish Chag. That's a different category. That has to do with the Kedushas Hayom, or the separate mitzvah of Shechita or Achilas HaPesach. Has nothing to do with counting heads, The Od, and furthermore, Imhu Midivreim. Okay, now he quotes a Gemara on Daf Tzadi Heyamid Beis in Psachim. I'm tempted to want to get up and bring a Gemara to read to you the Gemara. Maybe I should do that, but let's just first read it in the Ramban. Rabbi Yossi expresses himself in astonishment in the Gemara on Daf Tzadi Heyamid Beis, 95b. And he says the following: Efshar shachtu Yisrael es pischeihem v'lo amru shira. Is it thinkable? Again, in the context of a debate that he had with other Tanoim, can you allow the thought to pass your mind that Bnei Yisrael was shechting the Korban Pesach and they didn't recite Shira? And that's the Mishnah that establishes that they recited Shira at the time of the Shchitas HaPesach. He goes on, Rav Yossi. And again, I'm going to add a word or two. Efshar shenotlu Yisrael lulaveim v'lo amru Hallel? Is it possible that the Jewish people took the lulav without reciting Hallel? Says the Ramban, the language of Rabbi Yossi, one of the Tanoim, is off base. If Hallel is only D'Rabbanan, why? Halo Davin Amro ki divrei Rav. Harav, here's the Rambam. The Rambam says that you cannot count Hallel as a mitzvah d'oraisa, as a mitzvah in Taryag, because it's only D'Rabbanan. Who wrote Hallel? Who authored Hallel? David HaMelech. It wasn't given to Moshe Rabbeinu at Har Sinai. Behu beis dino tiknua. The Rambam insists that it was the Beis Din of David, after David authored Hallel, meaning Tilim, they established the mitzvah of Hallel, and therefore it's got to be D'Rabbanan. Oh, Beis Din Shalach Re'em, or maybe a later Beis Din after David HaMelech had authored Tilim, Tiknu also. So if it was a takana of Beis Din, then what's going on over here? Why is Rabbi Yossi exclaiming in his astonishment, it's impossible that they didn't recite Hallel? Tikdus ala Pesach ala Lulav. Maybe the Rabbanan established at the time of the Korban Pesach, at the time of taking the Lulav, you should recite Hallel, because the entire enterprise of Hallel is a takana de Rabbanan, says the Rambam. The Keva shetakanahu, if it's only a takana, as the Rambam insists, ain't lo Rabbi Yossi kusha. Rabbi Yossi should not be asking a kasha. How is it possible that they omitted Hallel? Al mi sheyited osa takana leDavid omer Hallel leBeis Din Akron. Aval aroi sheyia miyaches oso liad sheknes hagdola shemisaknina and tfilos ubrachos. Ve'al kol panim yomru Hallel ze atzmo mukdam leDavid. How does Rabbi Yossi know that way back at the time that they brought the Korban Pesach and they took the Lulav in the Mishkan, they must have said Hallel if Hallel was a Takanas Chachamim that took place either during the lifetime of David or way after the lifetime of David? Rabbi Yossi's astonishment, his exclamation, could only be justified and understood if we assume the premise that Hallel is D'Oraisa. And therefore, Rabbi Yossi says, how could you possibly understand that they did not say Hallel and they did not fulfill their mitzvah D'Oraisa of Hallel? If the entire enterprise of Hallel and even the Takana at the time of Achilas HaPesach and Netilas Lulav and Mikdash, all that is D'Rabbanan, as the Rambam would insist, then why is Rabbi Yossi astonished? The Takan of Hallel was much, much later on. And therefore, Nirami Divreya, Ramban now summarizes his conclusion based on all the proofs that he's suggested, Shehu min Torah, that the mitzvah of Hallel is D'Oraisa. And basically, there was no need for the Bahag to be Machadesh, that we count mitzvahs D'Rabbanan in Taryag in order to cover Hallel. He didn't have to cover Hallel by saying, well, we're going to count mitzvahs D'Rabbanan under Taryag. But more fundamentally, the Rambam, who insists that Hallel is D'Rabbanan and therefore cannot be counted in Taryag, made a big boo-boo. And even if we're on the turf of the Rambam, that we can only include in Taryag mitzvahs D'Oraisa, Hallel, the Rambam should have conceded that Hallel is D'Oraisa, therefore it should be counted in Taryag. You might ask me, if Hallel is Doraisa, what's the source in the Torah? I looked in the Torah. Again, in Tanakh, I found the source for Hallel. Shir, Hallel, and Kaddish Chag, but where in the Torah is there a mitzvah mandate to recite Hallel? Where is it? Says the Ramban, two possibilities.
Maybe Song of the Sea?
Well, the Song of the Sea was a spontaneous response and expression of salvation at the great miracle of the splitting of the sea, but that doesn't obligate me to recite Hallel. So the Ramban has two possibilities. Possibility number one is halacha l'Moshe Misina. And no offense, that's a little bit of a cop-out. Whenever you don't find a source for something that you assume is Doraisa, you always have to say, well, it's halacha l'Moshe Misina. Oh, but now the Ramban takes a bold step, a leap of faith, as you'd call it, shehu bechlal hasimcha, that the mitzvah of Hallel is included on the simcha. And this, my friends, is the reason why the Ramban does not critique the Rambam for having omitted Hallel from the counting of Taryag. The Ramban, in this book that we're reading, has many critiques of the Rambam for having omitted mitzvahs. Like, for example, the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael is the most famous of them all. But nowhere does the Ramban critique the Rambam for omitting the mitzvah of Hallel. And there are two answers to that question. One answer is because it's halacha l'Moshe Sinai, and therefore it's not included in Taryag. The other answer is because it is included in Taryag, but it's part of a greater mitzvah of Simcha. So the mitzvah of Simcha generates not only an obligation to eat meat and to drink wine, but the mitzvah of Simcha generates a mitzvah, an obligation of Hallel. Simcha means an appreciation of the Yad Hashem, of the providence of God in my life. That's what Simcha is all about. And whenever you see the word Simcha, you'll always see Lifnei Hashem. When I realize and I sense Hashem, that's Simcha. And that generates an obligation to thank Hashem for the cause of Simcha, for whatever the cause is. In the case of Sukkot, maybe the Anani HaKavod. In the case of Atzeres, it's the Matan Torah. In the case of Pesach, it's Yitzias Mitzrayim, the Geula. Whatever the reason for Simcha is, that Simcha will always obligate me in thanksgiving to praise Hashem for whatever brought about Simcha. Kimoshe Kasu, and I'll prove it to you. Ubiyom Simchaschem, Ubemoadechem, Uveroshe Chadshechem, Uskatem Bechatzotros, Alalosechem Ve'alzivchei Shalmechem. Okay, I'm going to test you guys. Where does this pasuk appear? In which parsha in the Torah? It's very easy to remember if you're a New Yorker. Because if you travel the highways of New York, then you always inevitably have to turn on a station. That's called 1010 Winds. Did you ever hear of it? And that's where you'll get the latest update on traffic in New York, which is always horrible. So in the 10th chapter of the book of Bamidbar, what's that called in English? Numbers, right? Numbers. And in the 10th passage, in the 10th chapter, that's why I call 1010, you'll find the pasuk B'yom Simchaschem Uvemoadechem. And what is the Torah obligating me? To blow the chatzotzos. What is blowing the chatzotzos? On Yom Simchaschem. Well, what is that all about? And the answer is, there are two categories of Shira and Hallel. One is Shira B'peh, and the other is Shira B'kli. And the instrument used in order to arouse our expression of gratitude and simcha is the chatzotz. And again, we have a long discussion here, not for now, that chatzotzos come under two different categories. One category is to alarm the people and gather them together as a tzibur. For example, on a Titus tzibur, we blow the chatzotzos. And the other is shira bikli, to recite and sing Hallel with an instrument, and that's chatzotzos. Ki ikar ashira b'peh. Don't misunderstand the Torah as if the Torah is telling me that how do I fulfill my obligation of Shira and Hallel by blowing the chatzotzos? No. The chatzotzos are only a background. The instrument is meant to accompany the song b'peh, and that song b'peh is Hallel. I have only one question on the Ramban. I understand biyom simchaschem and moadechem, but what's Rosh Chodshechem? We finished establishing that Hallel on Rosh Chodesh is only the Rabbanon. According to Ramban, Hallel on Rosh Chodesh has to be the Oraisa. You hear my question? And the Shira B'Kli is Libsume Kolahu. Libsume means it's an accompaniment to enhance the vocal expression of Shira, the singing. Here the Ramban is giving me an answer. Ala Korban. The simcha of Biyom Simchaschem is only in the Beis HaMikdash at the time of the Hakrovas HaKorban. Simcha generates a korban, and a korban generates Hallel or Shira. Says the Ramban, Shelo b'shas HaKorban. Is there a mitzvah of simcha that is independent of korban outside the walls of the Beis HaMikdash? And the answer is absolutely yes. And a moed is a day of simcha, and therefore it generates Hallel. But what about Rosh Chodesh? Rosh Chodesh is not in the Mikdash, and Rosh Chodesh is not a day of simcha. Is therefore mia to Rosh Chodesh begvulim mipnei she'eno mekudash lechag v'eno ton shu. It's a beautiful Ramban. If you read the Ramban carefully, the Ramban is justifying that there's no mitzvah of Hallel on Rosh Chodesh d'oraisa because there's no korban, you're not in the Beis HaMikdash, and there's no mitzvah of simcha on Rosh Chodesh.
So what's the reason we say Hallel then on Rosh Chodesh?
But the Ramban adds one word, and I would underline this word and blow it up. Bigvulin. Take a look at that Ramban. Miatu Rosh Chodesh Bigvulin. The Hallel on Rosh Chodesh was excluded, meaning it's not the real Hallel as we discussed earlier. Bigvulin. What's Bigvulin? Outside the confines of the Beis HaMikdash. What is the Ramban teaching me? Is there Hallel on Rosh Chodesh d'oraisa? The answer is yes. Capital Y, capital E, capital S, and add 3 exclamation marks. There is Hallel d'oraisa on Rosh Chodesh. But where? In the Beis HaMikdash. Because when they bring the special karbanos of Rosh Chodesh in the Beis HaMikdash, within the confines, the walls of the Beis HaMikdash, there's simcha, and that simcha is d'oraisa and generates Hallel d'oraisa. But bigvulin, outside of the confines of the Beis HaMikdash, where there's no karban and there's no simcha, Hallel is at best a knapper d'Rabbanan. Do you see why I emphasize that word bigvulin? Because the Ramban is shedding a whole new light on the issue of Hallel Rosh Chodesh. And this is going to answer your question, Bruce. Why do we recite Hallel on Rosh Chodesh? And the answer is Zeichel Hamikdash. Since Rosh Chodesh generates a Chiyuv Hallel, where? In the Beis HaMikdash. Therefore, we want to experience that Hallel. Yeah, I'll tell you the truth. We would bring a carbon on Rosh Chodesh if we only could. But the Torah says you're not allowed to shecht a carbon outside the Beis HaMikdash. So where does the Zeichel Hamikdash express itself on Rosh Chodesh? And the answer is Hallel. Hallel on Rosh Chodesh means that the Hallel that the Torah confines to the four walls of the Beis HaMikdash bursts forth and breaks the boundaries of the Beis HaMikdash to Gvulin as an experience of Zeichel Hamikdash, as if we were in the Mikdash. So the unique nature of Rosh Chodesh and its status is not lost entirely with the Churban Habayis. You and I would have said without this Ramban, we don't have anything left to Rosh Chodesh, except that we want to know exactly when is the first day of the month, so we'll know when is the 15th of the month and when to celebrate the holidays. But Rosh Chodesh has a special, unique day, inherent in the day itself, that went down, down, down to the depths of the sea with the Churban Habayis. Because all Rosh Chodesh is Karban. And that we don't have after the Churban. And the answer says the Ramban, that's wrong. We do have Rosh Chodesh today. The Rabbanon established Rosh Chodesh today as a day of Hallel. Where does that Hallel come from? Where does it originate from? Where is it anchored? And the answer is in the Beis HaMikdash. Because Rosh Chodesh in the Beis HaMikdash was a special, unique day. It was a day of Simcha and a day of Karban. Hence the pasuk now takes on new meaning. Ubiyom simchaschem, ubemoadechem, uverashei chodshechem, utkatem b'chatzotros, as the Ramban says, that's libsume kola, because the Ikar Hallel is not the chatzotros, but the Hallel b'peh, and that is a mitzvah d'oraisa, which applies on Rosh Chodesh, because Rosh Chodesh is a day of Simcha. Rosh Chodesh is a day of Karban. Rosh Chodesh is a day of Chatzotros, but only in the Beis HaMikdash. And this is a mind-boggling concept, that you could have Kedushas Hazman, the time is sanctified, but limited by Makom. In the Sholosh Regalim, we have the sanctity of time, but it's not limited to any Makom. You land a man on the moon, he's got to observe the Kedushas Hazman. But here, the Ramban postulates a sanctity of time that's limited in space. And that's the sanctity of Rosh Chodesh, which only applies in the Beis HaMikdash. We've extended it beyond the walls of the Beis HaMikdash by reciting Hallel on Rosh Chodesh, because the Jew longs, craves for the Beis HaMikdash. And that craving expresses itself in the desire to set up Rosh Chodesh as Kedushas Hazman, to go back to the pasuk of Biyom Simchaschem, Moadechem, V'Roshei Chodshechem, Uskatem, V'Chatzotros. We desperately need that, and we don't have it because we don't have the Beis HaMikdash. Okay, in the case of Moadechem, Yom Simchaschem, we have a mitzvah of Simcha. That's going to generate Hallel d'oraisa according to Ramban. But on Rosh Chodesh, we don't have a mitzvah of Simcha outside the Beis HaMikdash. So how can we establish Rosh Chodesh in our time, post-Churban, as a sanctified day? And the answer is through Hallel. The Hallel becomes an instrument to extend the Kedushas Hayom of Rosh Chodesh to Gvulin outside the Beis HaMikdash. Okay, Rabbosai, this is where we're going to stop for today. And I'll thank you for being with me. And Mitzvah Shem, we'll pick it up next week. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.